If you haven't heard about Anchor by Spotify, it's the easiest way to make a podcast with everything you need all in one place. Let me explain. Anchor has tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. When hosting on Anchor, you can distribute your podcast on listening platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. It's everything you need to make a podcast, and best of all, it's totally free. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Welcome to the Gods of Tomorrow podcast, where we discuss religious deconstruction, secular humanism, political activism, and epistemology. Together, we explore how to solve human problems with human solutions. We deconstruct, we activate, and then most importantly, we live our fucking lives. I am your host, Josh Ra, and you are the Gods of Tomorrow. All right. Let's do this shit. We are back. This is Josh Ra. You can call me Josh, and I think this is episode 9 for anyone who is actually counting. I got a quick joke for you guys. I heard it the other day that there was a priest, a child molester, and a liar that walked into a bar, and then he sat down and got himself a drink. No, I'm just playing. I'm excited to have you guys here with me today. We have a guest, ArchRadish. Chad, welcome so much to the show. I'm excited to have you sit down with me and share your story. You have a unique one.
I'm excited to sit here and talk with you, Josh. I mean, we've met each other before, and this is the first time we've been able to talk on air, and it's a real honor. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we got to hang out at the Atheist Convention down in Atlanta, and honestly, I don't think we got to spend enough time together to really dive into it. There was just so many people and so many things going on, it didn't really allow for it. So if you would be willing, just dive right into it and share with us some of your story in Christian fundamentalism and how you've gotten to where you are today. And I'll try not to interrupt too much, but I probably will ask you to clarify some things because I know there's a lot of acronyms and names that maybe not everyone listening to this show is going to be familiar with.
Oh, feel free to interrupt, definitely, because there is a lot. We'll warn you in advance. But, yeah, so I was born in an Independent Fundamentalist Baptist preacher's home. And for folks who don't know, the Independent Fundamentalist Baptist movement is essentially a spinoff of the Southern Baptist Convention from the early 20th century. It was largely credited to being started by a man named J. Frank Norris, who was pastor at First Baptist Fort Worth in Texas. Horrible person, if you ever get to read about him. But it kind of blossomed from there, and it operates very much like the Southern Baptist Convention, but it doesn't have any centralized denomination or no central authority to report to. It's just a loose conglomeration of essentially self-autonomous churches that all follow the Baptist faith. My dad was very huge into church authority, especially the local church. And so were pretty much all of his pastor friends. Like, each church operated as kind of its own little dictatorship. And, of course, there were also other leaders within that movement that a lot of people would follow in addition to their local pastor. So the way I describe it is it's kind of a cult in and of itself, but in more of a situation of, like, it's a cult buffet. Like, you can pick and choose which leaders you want to follow in this particular cult, but they're all loosely affiliated. He studied under a fellow named Jack Hyles of Hyles Anderson College, founder thereof. Didn't finish his course of study, but he did attend school there and was heavily influenced by that portion of Independent Baptist fundamentalism, and followed a few more leaders until we settled on one, Bill Gothard, who got his start in the 60s as leading these seminars as kind of a counterpoint to the cultural revolutions that were going on at that time, the civil rights movement, sexual revolution, that sort of thing.
And if I remember correctly, Bill Gothard is an individual who has since had 30-plus allegations against him for sexual misconduct and other issues in the church.
It's kind of a feature, not a bug, among these kind of leaders, honestly. Like, at this point, there have been so many allegations against so many people, including Bill Gothard, that, it's sad, but I'm not even surprised anymore. Every time I hear about one, I'm not even shocked at who was accused. I'm like, no, that actually makes sense. So yeah, Bill Gothard himself, he started a bunch of seminars, again, addressing youth conflicts, as he called it, and started a bunch of retreats and residencies and everything, focusing on youth, and that eventually branched off into a homeschooling branch called the Advanced Training Institute, which is the most generic name ever, but it was a very spicy cult, I will say. My parents were missionaries overseas before I was born. They started out, my dad is basically from the backwoods of Alabama, and he, again, fell in with the Independent Fundamentalist Baptist movement, became a missionary over in Europe, started losing his hearing, and then started a military church in England, which that's where I was born. 10 months later, we moved back to Alabama, and I lost my accent. So we lived in Alabama for most of my early life until my dad got, the technology on hearing aids became so much better that he could actually understand a little bit more about, the nuances of learning a different language. So we went back to the Netherlands and Belgium, where they had originally been missionaries. And that's where I spent most of my teen years. And in between times, while they were here in Alabama, my mother, who at the time was in her late 30s, early 40s, found a Christian OBGYN doctor who she went to here in the Birmingham area, and disclosed that they were missionaries, they were fundamentalist Christians, as was the doctor. And he encouraged her, saying, "By the way, how many children do you have?" She's like, "Well, 4." He's like, and she said, "But we're done." And he said, "Well, why not let God be the controller of that?" An OBGYN doctor basically told my mom, "You should leave your childbirth decisions to the Lord." So he got my parents into the Quiverfull Movement, which is essentially a movement that encourages Christian families to have as many children as physically possible in order to influence the world for Christ. And tied closely with the Quiverfull Movement, which the doctor himself is also seeking an educational related movement with his children, my parents and this doctor and his family all found the ATI program. That's pretty much the only schooling I had from then on, up until the time I graduated high school. ATI was very controlling. It was very limited in information. Most of the educational concepts were taught out of the Sermon on the Mount in the Bible. They essentially just took it verse by verse and tried to apply it across several different subjects, including medicine, science, their version thereof, mathematics, and what have you, saying that all you needed to know in life was through those passages. But unfortunately, it ended up being mostly those subjects as interpreted through the opinions of Bill Gothard and his close followers. So it was a subpar education, to say the least. And the idea was that, they would get you through high school, and then you would go work for Gothard if you were lucky at one of his training centers, of which he has several around the world. Indianapolis, Moscow, New Zealand, name it. Luckily, I missed out on that because we were in Europe doing something else. We were missionaries, and we were kind of outside, out of mind. But a lot of my friends, especially the ones I've made now who have also left the cult, they unfortunately ended up at those training centers and were pretty heavily damaged as a result. Those allegations of sexual misconduct against Bill Gothard were definitely from the people who worked for him. He had a tendency, according to the allegations, he had a tendency to select several young women who fit a certain type that he liked, and he would be very inappropriate with them behind closed doors in his office. Unfortunately, the lawsuits on that have been dropped for various reasons, mostly to do with timing and with the legal just red tape that has been going through and the trauma that they've already suffered. But Bill Gothard himself is now no longer over ATI or its parent organization, the Institute of Basic Life Principles. However, the organization still exists today. They still teach the exact same things as what he did, and they're still hurting people. So
I've heard rumors that they've been re-looking at some of Bill Gothard's teachings in that. And though they're still teaching it, they're just saying that he had too much of an authoritarian role, that his principles were still solid in terms of what they're teaching in the church. Is that accurate?
So the principles themselves are, they're not great. They tend to have a heavy focus on authority.
Yeah.
And, and of course that was in direct counterpoint to what was perceived as the rebellion of the 60s. And Gothard's whole idea was, well, if we need to get back to authority, we need to get back to character. The idea was a very patriarchal. The men in the families lead, the women follow and take care of the children. And if anybody's ever seen the God's biblical model for the family, the 3-tiered umbrella that's been shared around social media, what have you, that was developed by Bill Gothard. And those teachings, even though they may have had a lot of Gothard's name taken away from it, they have been sanitized enough to make it into the mainstream of Christianity, in my opinion. To where, that's a pretty common image. If you mention that, people very much have seen it, even in standard evangelical circles or what I would call mainstream churches. That's a very familiar image. So they may say that, it's that they backed off a little bit on the authoritative measures of it, but honestly, just from what I've seen them put out since then, and from their dogged defense of their teachings ever since then, I don't believe that they've done anything to lessen the harmful impact of it. Also, their character qualities that there are 49 of them. The character qualities that they teach, which we would assume to be positive traits like wisdom, creativity, what have you, they don't teach how to effectively have those qualities as we understand them in real life. They have their own definitions for them, and they redefine all those terms. So, for example, one of the primary character qualities that they teach is wisdom. And just as someone who's never been in ATI, if I were to ask you, how would you define wisdom, or what would you say wisdom is in a sentence or a synonym, what would you say?
The application of knowledge.
Exactly. And I think most people would say that it's, it has to do with knowledge, your intelligence, your application thereof, your perception. In ATI, the definition that they teach you, exclusive to everything else, is seeing life from God's perspective. And luckily, their curriculum just happens to teach you how to see life through God's perspective, according to them. So it's that, and like I said, there are 49 different qualities that they try to really hammer into you, but only their definitions thereof. And so it's language changing. It's very subtle control and manipulation of how they teach you certain concepts. And unfortunately, that still continues today.
So I was going to ask you, because I've seen this on your TikTok and your other social media, where you really are pushing this idea of the IFB being a cult. And I imagine that this specifically, this example of its language and how they're insisting that certain language being used applies to you saying this is a cult. But how else do you define this as being a cult, or why do you use that language specifically? We know that in modern terms it has like a negative connotation, but many, even Christianity or any belief system, probably started as a cult at some point.
Yes, I've heard say before, and I don't necessarily subscribe to this idea, but I've heard say before that a religion is a cult about 100 years after the death of its founder, which is not too far off. I'd say there's nuance there, but so I tend to use the BITE model of Stephen Hassan's BITE model of authoritarian control when I define cult, and for ATI. Like, you definitely can see it. For the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement as a whole, it's a little bit more nuanced, but I can give you several examples of behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control that these particular institutions have. And I'll give you an example. When my dad studied at Hyles-Anderson College, which is supposed to be the bastion of the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement. It's essentially the first college specifically dedicated to that. He was, of course, as a young student, very zealous and enthusiastic to go ahead and start preaching. So he asked the founder, Jack Hyles, if he could, pastor while going to school there. And Hyles said no. And my dad said, well, what if the Holy Spirit of God is telling me to do so? And Jack Hyles said, well, you're here. I'm the Holy Spirit.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's why my dad left that college. So, but that's the thing, though. Like, he was known for doing that with his students. No one ever took a vacation without asking him. In the early 90s, there was actually a news report where he mocked feeding his congregation poison Kool-Aid, much like Jim Jones.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, if I ask any one of these people to do it, they'd certainly do it. Wouldn't you, brother? Stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So so that authoritarian control is really what I think sets the IFB apart from mainstream religion. The pastor in each church reigns supreme. There may be a deacon board, but they have ceremonial power at that. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, the pastor in charge of that church reigns supreme, unless there's like some kind of church split or some kind of pseudo-democratic movement in the church, everything where they vote out a preacher. But honestly, like, that happens very rarely. The pastors are over their individual churches, and then abuses that happen within those churches, unfortunately, and there have been several documented cases of this, are either covered up or the perpetrators are protected and sent to other Independent Fundamental Baptist churches to kind of stay under the radar.
Yeah. The part of this, I think, that is probably most interesting to me, and I have other questions where I want to jump back into it, but I talked about this in my last podcast about how most churches that I know of don't have a governing board that really understand what psychological abuse and neglect or emotional abuse and neglect is, or understand child development in a way how certain ideas or concepts can cause trauma later on in life. And it sounds like you're really keyed into this specific group and how they not only don't have a governing board that looks into that, but they just completely bypass the idea of even considering it, where the person that is in charge of the church just essentially has all rights and they can do what they want to do without question. Are you aware of any churches that have a governing board that really looks at certain ideas or concepts or learning methodologies and says, you know what, this is really unhealthy in the development of children to be imposing this on them at such a young age?
In the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement, not really. I haven't run into any churches that tend to believe that, there's one common thread through all of them is a huge distrust of modern medicine, particularly in psychology.
Mm-hmm.
Like, my dad, said throughout my early career, or early life, I should say, as a child, I remember him saying that, self-esteem was a communist concept.
Hmm.
Seriously, like if we were watching PBS and they mentioned something about Sesame Street promoting self-esteem, he was just like, yeah, that's a new age, or that's a communist concept. We don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
And he would even tell us children, like, yeah, anybody tells you self-esteem, that's who. So, there is a huge distrust, and I think it's by design. Whether individual pastors realize it or not, there is I believe it's a calculated effort to make sure that, that any evidence-based actual help to help people develop their critical thinking skills and to question the authority in the church has been purposefully, like, by design, stamped out in these particular churches. And as far as any particular governing board or anything, no. I will give you one other example. Bob Jones University, which started out as an Independent Fundamental Baptist college, has for years had several documented policies that have been called into question, including like the early policies on segregation, which went way into the 70s, to their ban on interracial dating, which went in as late as 2000, and their cover-ups and their violations of or their ineffective sexual harassment policy and sexual abuse policy, and the reporting requirements for that, which was investigated by Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, or GRACE. Mm-hmm. They investigated Bob Jones University back in the early 2010s and found several violations of essentially the trust of people who came forward with stories of abuse, and had several recommendations on how they could better counsel their students and how to get them actual help. And the leader of Bob Jones University rejected most of them outright in the following Sunday, saying, well, that's what they recommend, but we're going to follow the Bible. So just things like that. Anytime any practical evidence-based solutions are presented, it's seen as in direct competition with the Bible, and they never get implemented. And unfortunately, nothing ever improves. I think the IFB is beyond hope, and I wish, the movement itself would cease, but that's probably too big a dragon to slay right now.
I'm trying really hard not to have like just an outrageous explosion here. I mean, especially as an individual who's primarily been raised in social sciences and have done that for a living for 20 years, because there's this clinging on to these old ideas and concepts from texts that are so old that it doesn't allow humans to ever progress or move forward. And I've said this before on my podcast, and I still kind of stand by it, that I myself am not against people who want to believe in the Christian mythology or use, the Bible or God or Jesus as a way of like finding their own spiritual path in some way. I'm okay with that. But things specifically that we're talking about here, where you have cult-like entities that are using that mythology that are completely disrupting people's lives and causing trauma in such a way that they will never be able to progress as an individual. That's where I draw the line, and I agree with you. Things like this have to cease. Like, they have to stop. Like, and I'm going to use air quotes for those that can't see, but the good churches need to be shutting down these places that are really destroying their belief system and are causing harm to individuals.
Yeah, and that really leads to why I left Christianity in general, because when I first started finding out about these rampant abuses that have been going on, not only in the IFB in general, but specifically the leaders that I followed. When I found out what all they had been involved with, I approached my dad about it, and I said, hey, Bill Gothard has abused people. Jack Scott, who took over Hiles-Anderson College, went to jail. Said all these people are engaged in this abuse. It's starting to look systemic. And he said, well, we just don't talk about that. And I said, that's interesting, because you've been very clear about condemning entire groups of people from the pulpit that you believe are engaged in sin. But when your people do it, you don't want to talk about it. He said, that doesn't make sense to me. And he said, well, we don't want to hurt the cause of Christ. I said, isn't it hurting the cause of Christ to abuse people? I mean, I'm sorry, but I feel like that has more lasting damage. So I left fundamentalism and I went into mainstream Christianity. But one weird thing that I noticed was, even in more progressive churches, anytime I would tell my story, people would start making excuses for the ministry that I was in. They're like, well, we can see some high controlling ministries being beneficial to people. And I'm like, maybe, but not this one. Like, I can tell you right now, there's a lot of abuse happening, and somebody needs to be looking at this. And the tendency for, even mainstream Christians to want to, protect their own, as it were, even if it wasn't what they themselves believed, but it was part of that whole grouping. It really led me to think, I'm like, is there any place for me in this? And I will say, I barely have a high school education, thanks to the call. I'm not a very smart person. I'm no intellectual. I couldn't go toe to toe with everybody theologically. But what I do know is that, what I was involved with is wrong. And if they can't provide a good answer as to why, they're not doing something about it, then I don't want to be affiliated with that either. I don't have room in my life for people to make excuses for abuse.
Yeah, well, don't cut yourself short. You're very well spoken and very intelligent. This is a very eye-opening conversation for me. I mean, I was part of some Baptist churches and Methodist churches in the Midwest, but they were nothing like this in terms of like this type of intensity that was being presented to individuals. You also started talking before we got cut off a little bit there about being very clear about some of the things that you're against that were being taught. Can you repeat that piece?
Oh, certainly, yeah. My dad from the pulpit said that LGBTQ plus people who would get married or adopt were setting themselves up to abuse children, and which is something I want to be very clear. I do not believe at all. I am supportive of the LGBTQ plus community, especially after leaving the church, fundamentalism, and all that. And what I was taught in my early days of fundamentalism, I absolutely 100% revoke. That was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But he would, and other people in the movement would just bash entire groups of people based on a perceived sin and never address what was happening in their own camp. Like, it just blew my mind, and that's pretty much what just soured me on the hypocrisy of it all. It's just like, you can't tell me that you can blanket condemn entire groups of people when you blanket amnesty entire crimes that just because they happen with your friends. Like that's not what I signed up for.
I'm really curious. You mentioned this earlier, and we're kind of like on a revolving door because there's so much to unpack here. But you talked about the Quiverfull Movement, and I wonder how much this type of ideology of like damning the LGBTQ plus community and damning interracial relationships, which you mentioned a bit before, and having as many kids as you can and letting that be in God's hand. Like, does all that intertwined? Is all that connected with this Quiverfull Movement that was pushed through this idea?
I believe the Quiverfull Movement is, in fact, rooted in white supremacy. I believe it is rooted in this fear that minorities are going to, take over, as a lot of the replacement theory that you see now in the mainstream of the conservative movement here in the States. As you see that being pushed out, I believe that the Quiverfull Movement was one of the earlier responses to that still persists to this day. And I believe it's rooted in that. I believe it's rooted in this idea of patriarchy, in that men are best qualified to lead their families, and the verse in the Bible that the Quiverfull Movement is based off of is in Proverbs. I don't remember the exact address, but I believe it says, "As arrows in the hands of a mighty man, so are men's children. Blessed is he who hath his quiver full of them." And so the idea was that the man of the family would have all these children and then fire them all out into the world as opposing, Satan's machinations. And of course, those happen to be, with the LGBTQ plus community and what have you. But a lot of just equal rights for minorities and people who are marginalized were seen, like any progress was seen as the work of Satan. Like even people of different races just having equal rights as anyone else was seen as a liberalization of society. And even by the founder of Bob Jones University himself, Bob Jones, said that racial equality was essentially ushering in the New World Order. So, yeah, it was, all of this was to promote the power structures that were already in place and to protect them against perceived threats from people who just simply were trying to live, and it's wrong.
So now I'm going to bring out the hard question, because you lived this, you breathed this, it was part of your childhood. You were conditioned to essentially go into this same lifestyle and be a missionary, which you practiced for a while, in trying to convert people, if I'm correct, in the exact same type of belief system. How did you, I guess, break free from that, open your eyes, accept a different way into understanding the world? And what is and secondly, after we get through that, what has your process been to heal from that?
Ooh, wow. I could literally write books on this, but as far as like getting out and like unconditioning myself from a lot of that, being able to live overseas, I think, kind of started a lot of questions in my mind, because if you just stay in one spot all your life, you're not going to learn a whole lot. But if you go out and you see that there's a world beyond the borders of your state, your county, or what have you, and you see how other people live, and how it's not necessarily wrong, it's just, a different culture, a different way of living and all that. If you're able to at least witness it, that in and of itself should be able to educate you a little bit more on how people differ. And so even though I was in my own little fundamentalist bubble overseas and trying to convert people to it, it wasn't lost on me that a lot of the people that my dad went around the state saying, "Oh, we need to reach these people because they're lost, they're desperate, they're depressed, they're without God and everything," a lot of them seem to be doing just fine. Like, they were just living their lives, working a 9 to 5 like anyone else. And we were fortunate being in the Netherlands and Belgium. They're some of the most affluent countries out there. and also with strong Christian backgrounds, of course, according to my dad, the wrong kind. But but they were just, they were just living lives completely unbothered. And when we showed them what we had, they were like, "Yeah, no thanks. We're not interested in being Americans." They're like, "We got our own thing going on." So that was the start of it for me, looking back. And then when I came back to the States with, very little experience to speak of, I threw myself completely into church work. And I'm the kind of person that tends to get over involved in everything. So I was a music minister. I did door-to-door soul winning at every church that I worked at. I, was part of the, I would teach Sunday school if asked and stuff like that. Just basically, hey, put me in, coach, wherever it was. And I gradually, got to know through several bad experiences with the fundamentalist movement that there was corruption all the way up in every single church that I went to.
Mm-hmm.
There was one where the pastor just straight up, emotionally abused his wife. She almost filed for divorce, but through the machinations of the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church, they got back together. And even though he had left the church when the scandal hit the paper, he came back like a couple months later and said, "Okay, well, we got it all fixed now. Never mind." And the church voted him back in. Just unquestioned. I knew that was wrong, even though I was in the church at the time. I was like, wait a minute, that just doesn't happen that way. So I left there, and I just kept seeing these bits and pieces of corruption happening. Meanwhile, specifically with like marginalized groups, I never really made a living off of working at a church. I still had day jobs on top of that, and whenever I worked a job, it would inevitably be with people of different races or people of different sexualities. And in fact, one of my main jobs, like, my first week and everything, I was paired with someone who's lesbian. And I've always been taught that, lesbians hate men. They try to do everything they can to bring them down, promote themselves. She was invested in my success. She seriously took time to train me, and everything I needed to know, was kind, firm, but kind, and got to be one of my best friends at work. And I'm like, this goes against the narrative of what I was taught. So to me, the exposure to things that went against the narrative that I was taught, like, all people of this particular sexuality or this particular race are just, are just out to hurt people. No. Exposure to different kinds of people who broke down the narrative, and then seeing how the narrative didn't work and how it was constantly covered up and just the hypocrisy of how it was carried out in the fundamentalist church. The more I dug into leadership and what was actually going on, I was just like, no, one of these things is not real.
I absolutely love that message. It's something that I talked about too, the dangers of ethnocentrism, that if you just get so caught up into one culture, one community, one lifestyle, and never expose yourself to something else, you will never grow, you'll never progress, and you'll become rigid. It causes bigotry, it causes all sorts of issues because you only accept one narrative. And so no matter where your belief system is, I encourage that. Whether you're a agnostic, an atheist, a Christian fundamentalist, a Buddhist, whatever it is, go out and experience other cultures and challenge yourself to see things through other people's eyes. And just don't get caught up in one thing, because that's where extremism comes in. All right, so into the second question, how have you healed? What does the healing process look like? Because going out and preaching to people, and I know for myself, I was a youth pastor, I was a stand-in pastor, I did a number of different things, and I think back to all the folks that I converted or changed or led on a certain path that I no longer accept as being the correct path, and going, it's a lot of internal work. It's a lot of self-healing to figure out what I do with that. Do I call every person I ever talk to and say, yeah, maybe second guess what I told you?
Yeah, believe me, that's one of the questions that keep me up at night. And part of the healing process I'm still working through. The damage that I caused while I was in, what happens there, because there's no way I can go back and find every single person that I ever witnessed to that prayed a prayer, or every person that I wronged when I was in, because, even with as good a connections are these days with social media, it would be nigh impossible for me to find every person around the world I did that to. So that is one thing that I just kind of hope that, people saw for themselves, like, hey, that nut back there was wrong. And honestly, if they think terrible about me the rest of their lives, quite frankly, I'm okay with that if it gets them out of it. But yeah, as far as healing for myself goes, like, I left fundamentalism, as I said, when I saw all the hypocrisy. And I did, for what it was worth, even though I ended up not staying in Christianity or in religion in general, being able to try different versions of Christianity and, going through that process of trying to, I didn't call it deconstruction. I just said, I'm just going to start with a blank slate. So I'm just going to, all the little ritual stuff and all the little things that we did that was specific to fundamentalism, I'm not going to do anymore. I said, I'm just going to go from the basis that, I was a sinner in need of salvation, Jesus Christ saved me, and we'll just see what happens from there. And about 2 years after that, I was like, well, shit. Maybe I need to go a little deeper than that. But I did look into that. I looked into different religions in addition to Christianity. Unfortunately, pretty much everything I looked into was either it seemed to go into like a cultural thing that I didn't feel was right for me, or I didn't feel right participating in, just simply because it felt like I was appropriating something, or it was something I couldn't do. I was like, I'll just leave that aside. But the more I looked into all these things, I eventually, one day, even though I had pretty much mentally checked out, I was still going to church, because that's what you do in the South. You have a church and you meet with people every week, and I was like, I'll just leave it at that. And for some reason, I just felt, as I was driving down the road, that I just couldn't be part of it anymore. I said, look, this is a facade, really. Like, most of the people there don't agree with, with what you believe anymore. And, it felt like a lot of emotional labor to keep that up. So as I was driving down the road, I actually got off several exits early. And that Sunday, I just went to a coffee shop instead. I got me a cup of coffee, and I went to the park across the street, Railroad Park here in Birmingham. I got up to like the highest bench I could, and I just looked up at the sky. And I was like, I got coffee. There's anything out there that actually wants to have a relationship with me, your turn. I've been looking for the past few years. You can take a step to. Like, we're not playing hide and seek here. So if you want to talk, I'm ready to talk. Let's do it face to face. At that moment, like, I sat there and I thought about like all the abuse I went through growing up, all the abuse my friends had gone through, and all the painstaking, search I've been doing and everything. I was just like, I wouldn't take this from any other relationship in my life. And that was another part of it. Like, I've been in several crappy romantic relationships. I was like, I wouldn't be in a relationship where I did all the work for one person anymore. Why would I accept it from this relationship? And after about 15 minutes of silence, I was like, where I live, I'll make tea. From then on, it's just been all about therapy, which I highly recommend. Like, even if you're not in a crisis mode or in a crisis state, healthy people go to therapy.
Yeah.
Like, I'm a firm believer in it. Just therapy, building up healing relationships with people, finding community in things other than, like, I'm awful glad I met you at the American Atheist Convention, and everyone else that I've met, especially through TikTok and what have you. It's just been a life-changing, amazing experience. But I also have several social groups that, meet, among other things. We have other interests. I'm very big into improv. I've been a huge fan of it for years, and I got involved with like local improv, local theater groups. Of course, it's easier, I suppose, if you're an extrovert like myself. I tend to just get involved in everything. But I find that just building relationships based off of a variety of interests and a variety of commonalities and everything really helps enrich and helps kind of fill that void where I do agree with what people say, at least with church, you had a community. But I feel like opening up your world and allowing community to find you through all the different things that make you uniquely you is also very good. So that's been a part of it for me.
Yeah, that is a beautiful message and probably a good spot for us to end on. So if you would, Chad, let folks know, where can they find you? Where can they connect with you? Where can they learn more about your story?
Sure. I'm on TikTok at ArchRadish, all one word. And, you can find me there, looking into doing different things coming up on YouTube and what have you, but all that's still in development. So for now, you can find me there, or, if you just happen to see me out and about on the internet, I post on Reddit from time to time. Yeah, just